I believe God is stirring the hearts, minds, and imaginations of Christians to recover the power of the arts and to recover beauty as kind of this lost aspect of the Christian life.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Winfield Bevins is an author, a visual artist, and the founding director of Creo Arts, a nonprofit that exists to bring beauty, goodness, and truth to the world through the arts. His new book is How Beauty Will Save the World, Recovering the Power of the Arts for the Christian Life. In this episode, Winfield and I talk about, how beauty will save the world. We also talk about a modern renaissance of the arts, moving from beauty to truth, and making space for Sabbath rest. Winfield Bevins, I'm so happy to have you on the Habit Podcast. Thanks for being here.
Hey, it's great to be here with you. Thanks so much for having me.
So I'm excited about your new book that's about to release, How Beauty Will Save the World. That's a big claim. I mean, you're riffing off Dostoevsky and that idea that beauty will save the world. A sentence that, to tell you the truth, I've never quite known how to make sense of it. What's the short version of how beauty will save the world, Winfield?
Yeah, I mean, definitely riffing off that famous quote. And I think a lot of people probably, it sparks imagination. It's very kind of theoretical or kind of ethereal. But how can beauty will save the world? That really is kind of the theme of the book. The subtitle is Recovering the Power of the Arts for the Christian Life. And so one of the things that I really try to do in the book is to help people who are drawn to the arts feel like there's something important here, but don't quite get it. It's the kind of book that artists would give their pastors, friends. I'm not trying to convince artists or creatives, although the book actually will be great for, those of us that are artists and creatives and writers or, whatever form of art you might do. But it's really to help Christians understand the importance and the value of beauty for, one, the Christian life, our own formation and discipleship, but also for the sake of the world. I really do believe that beauty points us to the one who's beautiful, good, and true, which is ultimately Christ. And I think there's a power in the recovery of that. And so that's kind of just a quick snapshot of the book.
Yeah. Well, we're all familiar with the three, obviously I'm not familiar enough. Now,
transcendentals, the beauty, goodness, and truth.
Yep. Yeah. You say beauty, goodness, and truth. Some people start with truth, goodness, beauty. Why do you start with beauty in that?
Yeah, I think, these are three historic transcendentals as they've been referred to, going all the way back to Greek philosophy. Christians have engaged this as kind of universal transcendentals in every culture context. These are the things that point to the ultimate truth. And oftentimes Christians, especially as we look at, say, the last 100 years, particularly in North America, we've tried to lead with just the truth, and we've presented the truth without beauty. And what we see is the three of those together actually point toward the ultimate beauty, goodness, and truth of God. And so we've tried to lead with truth. And so the question that I kind of raise in the book is, why not start with beauty? And kind of raising the question, is beauty, say, the new apologetic? Is it the thing? And I believe it is. I believe beauty and the arts prepare people's hearts and minds for conversations around the truth. So I think beauty without the truth isn't true beauty. And the truth without beauty is, it needs to be presented beautifully. And so that's kind of, one of the arguments of the book is we need all of those, but ultimately they're pointing toward the truth.
Yeah. At one point in the book, you quote Dana Gioia, and he says, whenever the church has abandoned the notion of beauty, it has lost precisely the power it hoped to cultivate, its ability to reach souls in the modern world.
Yeah.
I find that a very helpful formulation. The idea that there's a certain pragmatism, I think, to the way, let's say, evangelism is approached.
Yes. Yeah.
As if we can strip away everything but the propositions, and thereby make the truth more accessible to people. And you and many people before you have suggested that no, that's not how it works.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's part of the problem is we've become so pragmatic. So many things came out of, these kind of mega shifts over the last few decades, the Industrial Revolution, and the church really has embraced a lot of aspects of modernity. And what we see is that we live in a culture that there's this longing for beauty. We can reach people through the imagination. This is, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, obviously, like they're talking about the imagination as this vital kind of part of who we are as humans created in the Imago Dei, the image of God. And so by starting with this, I believe it can really help the church, in terms of church universal, but Christians everywhere to re-engage our culture, to re-engage our community, our children, our families, with this vital kind of recovery of beauty. And again, beauty is all encompassing. It's kind of speaking of that which speaks to the imagination. And I think beauty also has the power to, the imagination really is kind of that space in between the head and the heart. And oftentimes we've tried to, again, reach people with just the head alone, which is kind of, apologetic arguments, or on the other end of the spectrum, the heart. We just kind of want to win people's kind of, through charismatic, encounters or arguments. But the imagination touches this place that has the ability to reach both head and heart.
Yeah. One way to think about the role of, the connection between beauty and truth is, to quote Mary Poppins, a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down.
Sure. Yeah.
And I don't think that's a good enough account of what beauty is for. And so, this idea of leading with beauty instead of leading with truth, I think it's important that we not think of that as, see, you can kind of get people, you can grab their attention with some beauty, then you hit them with the truth.
Absolutely.
But the beauty is truth.
Yep.
It is a vision of reality that says there's a beauty in reality. And by the way, it takes imagination, as you said, to see that.
Yes.
To see reality. But there's a beauty in that you're being invited into as a human being.
Yeah, I mean, it's not an either or. And I think that is really the thing that we're getting at. We're talking about a holistic, embodied vision of the Christian life, that it's more than just pragmatic. It's more than theology is just more than boiling things down to a few key principles. This is an embodied, holistic framework for how we can live out the Christian life in the 21st century. And this is how Christians have thought and have lived and interacted with God for ages. We've just lost it in the modern world. And I believe God is stirring the hearts, minds, and imaginations of Christians to recover the power of the arts and to recover beauty as kind of this lost aspect of the Christian life.
Yeah. Chesterton, this is going to be a paraphrase rather than a quote, but he said, pragmatism purports to be concerned with human needs, and meeting human needs. But one of the first needs of the human being is to be more than a pragmatist. And I thought about that when I saw that Dana Gioia quote, that when you lose beauty, you're losing what we're here for in the first place. Yes. Yeah. And if we're saying we're going to be so pragmatic that we're going to, strip away beauty, we're saying we're going to be so pragmatic that we're going to be something less. We're going to appeal to something in you that's less than human. and we're not going to do a very good job of making people more human or connecting them with the transcendent without that.
Yeah, I think there's a real, again, when we really kind of look at the Gospels and re-engage Scripture through these lenses, we see this kind of holistic, embodied approach everywhere. We see it,
Mm-hmm.
with, Mary anointing the feet of Jesus. The disciples are like, "What are you doing?" Like this is
Mm-hmm.
costly perfume, and she's
Yeah.
that's what the arts are. Is they're not
Mm-hmm.
pragmatic. They're useless in a very kind of pragmatic utilitarian sense,
Yeah.
but they're the very thing that we need. And one of my favorite scriptures that Jesus he says, unless you have the faith of a child, we need eyes to see and ears to hear. And I think this is what artists give us. This is why the
Mm-hmm.
arts matter, is they teach us to look and to listen and to view our faith and the kingdom through the lenses of a child again. And I think that's what beauty is. We need to take a second look. It invites us to look, to pause, to ponder, to go deeply, to reflect. And these are the very things that I believe we need to recover in the times that we're living in.
Yeah. I love that quote from Rabbi Heschel that you include in your book, where he says, "I never once prayed for
Mm,
power or money or even wisdom,
yes.
but I prayed for wonder, and God
Yeah.
answered that prayer."
It's the recovery of wonderment, awe and wonder. Isn't that what the faith really is all about? And talk about winsome, talk about evangelism. What if we led with that, inviting people into wonder and awe,
Uh-huh.
and through encounter with it? And I think, here we are, in the Advent Christmas season. That's kind of the theme of all of this, is just the awe and wonder of the season that Christ brings to the world. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. You've already alluded, you didn't use the phrase in this conversation, but you used the phrase in the book of a modern renaissance of the arts.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? What makes you think there's a renaissance of the arts happening?
Yeah, I think it's more than a renaissance. I actually think I recently wrote a piece called Renaissance or Renewal question mark. I actually think there's a spiritual renewal aspect to this recovery of the arts that is it's much bigger than the arts. You're seeing this across the United States, I believe around the world. I've
Mm-hmm.
got, my fingers in some parts of the world interacting with others that are kind of thinking along these lines. Um, but a renaissance is, again, it's a recovery of arts, culture, education, and what I mean by this from through the lenses of Christianity is what you're seeing is Christians are re-engaging these kind of domains of society in which the last 100 years or so the church had disengaged.
Mm-hmm.
So Renaissance is kind of fresh rebirth, rethinking the word, coming from this idea of rebirth. And I think it's connected to a renewal. And it's really interesting. Almost weekly, sometimes daily, I encounter people reaching out to me through the work that I'm doing, with artists in different parts of the United States, where it's really happening everywhere. I mean, as I'm kind of encountering artists, patrons, churches, organizations, that they've all got this passion for the recovery of the arts, one for the renewal of the Christian life, but
Mm-hmm.
for engaging the world with beauty, for bringing hope and light and healing, and wholeness, through all of the arts, whether
Mm-hmm.
it's, whether we're talking literary, where we're talking visual, film, theater, dance. We're seeing artists being stirred to rise up and to use their art form, one for the glory of God, but for the sake of bringing hope and light to the world.
Mm. You used the word wholeness, and it reminds me that Christianity claims to give an account of everything, the whole world,
Sure. Yeah.
not just the spiritual
Yeah.
life. And I think that's part of the reason that art is so important with regard to faith, and as you said, an apologetic, because art doesn't even have the option of being only spiritual.
Mm,
You know,
yeah.
I mean, I'm seeing those pictures behind you, which the listeners can't see, but I can, and those are of spiritual themes. It looks like Mary and the baby Jesus may be back there, but every
Yeah.
one of those, when you made those things, you had
Yeah.
to make it with your hands.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Again, this idea of embodiment, holistic. God created us to co-create,
Uh-huh.
to one, to enjoy, but also to engage in, to use our hands, to use our minds, to use our hearts, our imaginations,
Hmm.
the recovery of the senses. You know, when you look at certain books of the Bible, the book of Revelation, for instance, is full of, sights, images, smells. There's incense, there's colors, there's tastes, and I think this is one, thing where the sacramental liturgical traditions of the faith have preserved these kind of sensory, kind of
Mm.
embodied
Yeah.
aspects of worship. And I think, again, this is one of the beauties of the arts. They remind us that God created us to co-create, to use our hands.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'm here in my home studio a couple years ago. We built out a studio, and it's kind of like a sanctuary. I kind of
Hmm.
see artist studios, again, whatever art form an artist is doing, as it's a place of encounter. If they're a believer, it's a sacred space where they are wrestling through. There's in the monastic tradition. There's this quote from one of the Desert Fathers that says, "Go into your cell and it will teach you everything you need to know."
Hmm.
And I think for artists, there's this like go into the studio, go to the
Mm.
studio and work it out, whether it's on the potter's wheel, whether it's, writing and wrestling, or, I'm a painter. I describe
Hmm.
my artwork as modern iconography. I go in the studio and I wrestle with the
Mm.
Lord. And it's really, I come out changed and transformed
Mm.
oftentimes, through
Mm.
encountering God through the co-creation process.
Mm. Yeah. Okay. In the book, you mentioned that you were saved by beauty, saved by art twice. I want to skip people can read the book to read about the first time that juvenile delinquent Winfield
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
was saved by art at the reformatory or the
Mhm.
alternative school.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but I want to hear you talk about the second time
Yeah. Yeah.
when which really wasn't that long ago, that you say you were saved by beauty.
Yeah. I had led a global program at a large seminary a few years ago. Was traveling the world, literally. I was working in 20 plus nations. I was writing books. I was,
Hmm.
doing all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And it was all good. It's kind of the Mary and Martha. I was doing
Hmm.
all this stuff for the Lord, but I wasn't being with the Lord. And my work had overtaken, and again, it wasn't the institution's fault. It was kind of
Hmm.
my, human nature, just gotten caught up in all of it, and had really come to a place of burnout, and
Hmm.
had laid aside the arts. Oftentimes art is the first thing to go when we start getting busy. You can't
Yeah.
create out of, stress and anxiety and, striving, and, there has to be abundance and space to create. And so I literally, through a series of events, I got COVID. All this stuff. I got the armor corn. I was laid up in the bed. My wife had me quarantined. I was in bed for 10 days. And I thought I was dying. I mean, literally,
Mm.
it was just a really dark place.
Mm.
And I was listening on my phone to streaming music, and this modern piano concerto came on by Alexis French, who's a British composer. The song is called Bluebird.
Hmm.
And I will never forget this. I don't know if Alexis is a Christian. Probably not. I don't know. Maybe doesn't matter.
Hmm.
When the song came on, it was like I felt the music go through me. And it was like I heard the music for the first time in my life. And I wept uncontrollably for about an hour. And the Lord used that experience to slow me down. Again, I'm skipping a lot of stuff, but that was really a life-changing encounter with beauty. And it was through music. And it was like the Lord put his finger on me and said, I'm going to make you slow down.
Hmm.
And so all of these things, being sick, burnout, and it changed my life. And I came out of that with really at a crossroads where, for me, and this isn't it's a false dichotomy for others, but it was really an answer to the call of being a full-time artist. And all these miracles started happening. As I slowed down, I began to see, I began to hear. God began to provide in some amazing ways for me that were just really shocking. And there shortly after, God gave me the vision to start Creo Arts, and which is a kind of a national nonprofit with a similar vision to Rabbit Room, with just helping to form, local communities where art and faith flourish, bringing beauty to local communities through the power of the arts. And honestly, I haven't looked back since. I
Yeah.
gave up, now there are days where I struggle with, doing too much. And, anytime I feel that sense of angst or anxiety, I pause. I remind myself I got to get in the studio. I need to get
Uh-huh.
back to that space with the Lord where I'm kind of co-creating. But yeah, that day, beauty definitely, in the book, I say there are two times beauty saved me. Really, beauty saving me every day. Every
Yeah.
time
Yeah.
I'm invited to slow down, every time I see a flower that invites me to stop and to look, to listen, beauty saving me maybe in 100 ways every
Yeah. That's
single
good.
day. Yeah.
Yeah. You in that part of the book, you talk about the idea of creating out of rest. Um, uh, there were two different phrases that jumped out at me now. I can't remember the other one, but creating out of rest. Um, how do you? I mean, you just mentioned you're running a pretty active organization. Creo Arts is not a, as you said, it's a national organization. There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
What can you tell me about creating out of rest when you've got so much to do?
Yeah, no, it's so good. People ask me all the time, like, how are you painting, leading this organization, writing books, traveling? You know, so I'll tell you this, as we were starting from the very beginning, the Lord gave me this vision. I was actually still at Asbury, and I talk about this in the book. All of this happened at the time that the Asbury revival or Asbury
Hmm.
outpouring happened, literally. We got our IRS letter of approval during the first week of the revival. So,
Okay.
what would you do if you got, your IRS letter during a major national, actually international, people came from all over the world. Um, I took that letter and I laid it on the altar.
Huh.
And I said, Lord, this is your work. If this is what you're calling me to do, this is yours. And what was wild was a few weeks after the revival, I was in Florida, and an individual who I had just met called me up and said, "The Lord told me to pay your salary for a year.
Mm.
Quit teaching and go full time with the arts." And I was not expecting this. I hadn't asked for it. I didn't even know that this person
Wow.
had money.
Yeah.
Like, and it was just like, it was amazing. And he said this. He said, "The only two things I ask is there are no strings attached. The only two things I'm asking of you is to keep the Sabbath and to love your family." And that has made all the difference. My family and I, everything we do, we work from rest.
Hmm.
And for me, for Creo, for the arts, it's all about working from a place of Sabbath rest.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we've done is we've built in, for most Christians, Sunday is not a Sabbath. I'm sorry. Like
Mm-hmm.
for a lot of Christians, if they teach or work, at the church or they're, it can be stressful. And so what we do is I do all the shopping, we get everything done, and 5 o'clock on Friday night, we put the pause on everything, and
Mm-hmm.
we kind of begin our Sabbath with our Friday evening meal. We light a candle, we say a prayer, and we set apart a day unto the Lord. And that kind of reorients us. For me personally, it's a reminder that God is in control,
Mm-hmm.
and that in the midst of the busyness and the chaos, He invites us to stop. And God,
Mm-hmm.
the Creator, created, and then on the seventh day rested. And so, that is, I believe, the secret sauce. I believe that is the missing thing for so many believers, but also creatives that have creative block, is that if
Mm-hmm.
we create space to create, for me as an artist, when I start getting busy and I start getting blocked in my own creativity, my own artwork is a symbol that I need to slow down and I need to rest.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of that. And then obviously, family, we got three girls, and they kind of help keep me grounded.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's so interesting that his requirement, not requirement, but as you said, the closest thing to a string, there's no strings attached, but he did request that you keep the Sabbath.
Yeah. It was, and it was one of the greatest surprises, and one of the greatest gifts anyone's ever given me. And I really dug in. I mean, I'd been I taught at a seminary, I'd pastored churches. I was, everyone
Yeah.
knows it, but the Sabbath is, out of the Ten Commandments, it's the one thing that Protestants are not good at.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And it's the very thing that, honestly, I think the arts teach us.
Yeah.
The arts teach us you can't create out of a space of strife, anger, angst, worry, fear. There has to be space
Mm-hmm.
to create. And, I journaled there early on as I took these faith steps. And one of, things that I felt like the Lord was speaking to me. And one of them was create space.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the greatest things that all of us, no matter who we are, no matter what we do, no matter whether we consider ourselves an artist or not, I believe, need to create space in our life to, one, to connect with the Lord, but also to be creative and to find whatever creative outlet or form of art that maybe we're called to.
Yeah. Will you? This is the first episode. This is the New Year's episode for 2026 for the Habit Podcast. And it's the idea of Sabbath has come up more than once on the New Year's episodes. I'd like to just give a little more space, let's say, for the Sabbath in this conversation, as people are thinking about, what their life is going to look like in this year and the changes they want to make to their habits and their work. Can you tell me a little bit more about making space?
Yeah, no, it's so good. A couple of years ago, a good friend of mine in Ireland, he and I kind of co-wrote a book and designed a training around this idea of healthy rhythms for leaders and Christians. And I think a lot of us, if you don't, we schedule everything. We put our appointments in our calendars, but we don't schedule rest, and we don't plan that out. And if you're not planning, you've heard it said, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. Why not do a study of Sabbath is what I would say. It's everywhere. It literally, once you start looking at this in the scriptures, it's everywhere. It begins the Bible. God, who is the artist, the great artist of all, he rests after he creates. And again, I think finding rhythms of a weekly, time to rest, to set apart space. I think creating space throughout our day, finding moments to pause, to pray, but also to create. I think if
Hmm.
if you're on the podcast and you're an artist or a creator, if you don't schedule it, if you don't make time to create, and I actually do a thing. I led a workshop on finding your rhythms for writing, and it's kind of the same thing that applies to whatever form of art. And I actually think for leadership, I think whatever we do vocationally, these principles all apply. And I think one is finding a day apart, setting aside a day as a Sabbath. I think
Hmm.
finding a time throughout each day to pause, to create space, just to do nothing. Maybe
Hmm.
it's journaling is a good exercise and practice. uh, Oftentimes, I think in terms of how can we find space daily, weekly, and then oftentimes I try to get away once a month or a
Mm.
couple times a month. Not like an overnight, but I live in Kentucky, and so one of my favorite things to do is I go to the Abbey of Gethsemane, which is
Hmm.
kind of Thomas Merton was there, his famous monastery. Finding places where we can go and just be, learn
Hmm.
to recover. And that this idea, well, it's the habit podcast, isn't it?
Hmm. Yeah.
Creating these holy habits, these sacred rhythms in our life, and then an annual retreat. And, the funny thing is, Jonathan, today I was supposed to go on my annual retreat to the Abbey and I'm snowed in. So I'm
Mm.
not getting my annual retreat, which is a bummer for me.
Yeah.
But, think in terms of trying to get away for an extended time, maybe once a year. And that's
Hmm.
a huge reset, especially as we're talking January, first of the year, New Year's
Hmm.
rhythms, is get away and hit a reset. And what I've
Hmm.
found is, as a busy person, to your question earlier, if I don't do that, oftentimes in the frantic kind of plate spinning, we end up like it's like we're riding a wild horse, but we don't know where we're going. We're on this
Yeah.
horse,
Yeah.
and it's like the Lord's yelling at us as we're driving, like, "Where are you going?" And we're just charging. I don't know, but
I'm going fast.
I'm going fast.
Can't you see I'm going fast? Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think that's how most of us really feel if we're really honest. That's how I felt as I shared in the book with that song that invited me to get off the horse and to just learn to be.
Hmm.
And so that would be my encouragement is God invites us in every moment of every day to to be with him, to hit
Hmm.
that reset, that pause button. Every moment can be a new beginning.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be this big,
Mm.
seismic, massive thing that we have to do, but it's just pausing and being present in the present moment. And that's where God is. He's not in the
Hmm.
past, he's not in the future. He invites us into the present moment.
It's really hard to believe that what all we're called to do is to be rather than to accomplish.
Yes. That's the hardest thing. And it's in the scriptures. Like it's
Mm.
just the invitation. And I think that's what the Sabbath is for me. It is a weekly, I use the language of reattunement.
Mm.
So realignment to the kingdom. I actually think, and Abraham Heschel's got this incredible book on the Sabbath. Actually, that's where I would say start.
Yeah.
Let
Okay.
that be your
I've never
new.
read that. Every time I run across, I
Oh,
think I've got to read this book, and I never
it's
have.
incredible. He speaks of the Sabbath as like the fourth dimension.
Mm.
And I think there's so much wisdom in that Jewish tradition of the recovery of the Sabbath is for them, they call it the Sabbath as a cathedral in time.
Mm.
So we build buildings, we build programs and institutions. That's the stuff that's burning us out. But
Hmm.
for that kind of ancient, Jewish Sabbath understanding is the Sabbath is a sanctification of time. And for me personally, what I've discovered is it's like a reattunement to kingdom reality, whereas the world's
Hmm.
beating a different drum. And I think our tech, our media, all these things are attuning us to a different frequency. The Sabbath reattunes us to God's frequency and the
Mm.
kingdom.
Yeah. And it's so helpful to be reminded once a week that if I don't do anything, the world keeps spinning.
Well, I told my wife this morning what I love about these monks at the Abbey is they gather to pray 7 days a week. And, I'm really close with one of the monks, Brother Paul, who was a novice under Thomas Merton. And I was like, Brother Paul has been there for 65 years. Like 65 years. He's been praying 7 times a day, gathering in that Abbey chapel, regardless of what's happening in the news or the media, regardless of what's happening in the world, wars, rumor of wars, all this stuff. And regardless of what's happening with the weather. I mean, think about this.
Yeah.
Here I'm stuck, at my house in Kentucky. He's praying, 7 times. He's going to keep doing the stuff that he's doing.
Yeah.
And I think that's what the Sabbath is. It does remind us to pause, and regardless of what's happening in the world, we can lay our anxieties aside for a day and say, God, I'm going to trust you with my life, my finances, my family, and everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was able to take a 3-week vacation last, I guess it was this year. Well, anyway, 2025, took a 3-week vacation.
Yep.
And when I came back, everything was still standing. It was,
the world.
I had more emails than maybe I wanted, but otherwise the world just kept doing just fine without me. That was really helpful.
If you can do it, week 1, you're just defragging.
Yeah.
Week 2 is like a real rest. And man, week 3, I've never done that. So I might have to try that one, John.
I didn't know how I was going to go, but it went just fine.
The world was still here when you came back.
That's right. All right. Hey, I wanted to talk about border stalking, but we're not going to have time to do that. So I loved your discussion of border stalking in your book. So hopefully people can get that book and read that for themselves. But I do want to ask you the question that I typically ask at the end of these conversations. That is, who are the writers who make you want to write?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, obviously C.S. Lewis. I have this mix of, I love those great British authors. Thomas Merton has really inspired me. There's something about that monastic rhythm of, prayer, work, rest, and there's some really great stuff that he's written about writing. There's a book actually about his journal entries about rhythms of writing, and Chesterton's work has also been very influential and inspirational for me.
Yeah. All right, well, Winfield Bevins, thanks so much for being here. It's such a pleasure to talk, and I hope a lot of people read and benefit from your book.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been great to have a conversation with you today.
The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. You can support their work, including this podcast, by becoming a member. Visit rabbitroom.com/membership. Special thanks as well to Taylor Leonard for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorleonard.com. The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.